Hello everyone, welcome to Series 2 of the GBA Lightbulb Sessions. The Great British Entrepreneur Awards in association with BT Skills for Tomorrow have designed a free live stream series of Lightbulb Sessions to support small businesses and entrepreneurs with insightful and advice-driven sessions featuring some of the UK's brilliant entrepreneurial minds to illuminate your path to entrepreneurial success. You can find out more about BT Skills for Tomorrow by heading to their website at www.bt.com/skills for tomorrow or by clicking on the link in the comments section. In today's session, Great British Entrepreneur Awards Head of Content Jonathan Davis will speak with leading social entrepreneur and passionate changemaker Mel Young MBE. Mel will identify how being a social enterprise can compare to a purely for-profit business, what it means to be a social entrepreneur and have social values, and how your business can support social change in the world for a brighter future. There is an opportunity to ask questions during this session. If you have a question you'd like to ask Mel, you can pop this in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer these throughout the session. Mel has also kindly gifted the first 10 people who sign up to the Newisms newsletter a free copy of his new book, Social Entrepreneurship, A Better Way of Thinking About a Sustainable Future. We will share details of how you can redeem this towards the end of the session. And with that, I'll pass over to our host today, Jonathan Davis.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chloe. Mel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm sure that a lot of people on this webinar know who you are, know of you, but just for the benefit of those who don't, would you mind kind of introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do?
Hi, Jonathan. Yeah, thanks. And thanks for inviting me along. Happy to be involved in today's session. I'm a social entrepreneur, have been for decades. I think I was a social entrepreneur before I even knew I was a social entrepreneur. I'm based in Edinburgh, in Scotland. Been involved in various social initiatives. Probably one of the best known is the Homeless World Cup, which is now operates in 72 countries around the world and as an annual event somewhere in the world. But I'm also started a new venture with Alex Matthews called Newism, which is the book's connected with, which is talking about how we create new systems for a fairer world. So I'm involved in a lot.
Excellent. So I want to start by asking, jumping in at the deep end. What does it mean to be a social entrepreneur?
I mean, I think people ask me what's the difference between entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs, and I always think that the DNA of an entrepreneur is very similar to that of a social entrepreneur. Very driven people, don't take no for an answer, willing to take risks, not particularly good managers, but make things happen. The difference between an entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur is that social entrepreneurs' bottom line is different. They're interested in what the impact is they're making in the social environmental field to make the world a better place. Whereas entrepreneurs, not always nowadays, but driven by profit or growth or expansion or whatever. And so there's very similar DNA difference. So what it's like to be a social entrepreneur then, incredibly gratifying, because for me, I worked in the area of homelessness for a long time. The profit for me is actually meeting a homeless person who kind of says, as a result of initiatives that I've been involved in, they've changed their lives completely and they're no longer homeless. And it makes you feel really good. Or, other social entrepreneurs I know, something's happened in the environmental field. As a result, more trees have been planted or whatever, and it makes them feel good. So that's what it's like. Very hard work, very difficult at times to achieve what you want to achieve, but very, passionate social entrepreneurs. So I feel very passionate about some of the issues. But the bottom line is something that's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And so talk us through your journey into becoming a social entrepreneur. I know you mentioned that you were one before it was a thing. Was it something that you always planned, or did you just kind of stumble into it?
I've always been very concerned from young age about certain kind of social issues, but also been very entrepreneurial. And then I'm sure you've had discussions in these sessions before. Are entrepreneurs made or do you learn? I probably think, it was on my DNA to be entrepreneurial all the time. When I left university, the first thing I did was start a magazine, not necessarily in the social enterprise space, but always kind of the issues around social inequality were a concern to me. So I was starting, involved in those sort of initiatives, pulling together elements of the business world, if you like, with the social world. But the term social entrepreneur is a relatively new one, really over the past 2-3 decades. So when I started, the term wasn't there. I was involved in, with some others, starting the big issue in Scotland in 1993. And it was towards the middle of that decade, towards the end of that decade, that somebody said to me one day, you're a social entrepreneur. So I kind of thought about it and said, yeah, that's indeed what I am. So once I knew what I was, then I was doing what I was doing, as it were. So that was the beginning of the journey. And the big issue for me was always really important in terms of understanding what it is, because it's about a hand up, not a hand out. So homeless people are working, selling the magazine, and keeping a significant percentage of the cover price. Then the other percentage of the cover price plus the advertising was keeping the enterprise going, so that you didn't need donations or handouts. The enterprise in itself was self-financing, could run on its own, and how you behaved within that meant how the business behaved. And then as a result, you were getting this huge social impact as a result of the homeless people's efforts in selling the magazine. So those principles have always kind of held back going through in the rest of my journey. So it's a unique space to be in, and being involved in some fantastic initiatives and discussions, and met some really inspiring people around the world over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And we mentioned the Homeless World Cup. It's an incredible initiative, and it's something that we've been to when it was in Cardiff, literally right across the road from our office a couple of years ago. When you started it, how difficult was it to get something such a big idea off the ground when, at that time, social enterprises were still quite unknown, still quite new? How difficult was it to get that off the ground when it was never designed to make money and make profit?
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult, if I'm being honest. We tell the story how myself and a colleague called Harold Schmidt, we came up with this idea in a bar and developed it. And the more beer we drank, it's typical entrepreneurs, actually, we came up with the idea. But then the critical thing, if I'm doing kind of talks about this, was we're away at a conference, and we met again the next morning at breakfast and said, that was a great discussion, but will we make it happen? That was the key decision at the breakfast time, when we said, no, we're going to make this happen, which we did 18 months later. But it was difficult because people thought we were crazy, and kind of said, well, how's that going to work? And the business model for the Homeless World Cup really is very similar to the Olympics. The Olympics is obviously much bigger and has huge budgets, but really primarily our incomes comes from rights that we have. So cities bid to host it and then pay rights, and then we have sponsorship, et cetera, et cetera. That's our income base, and then we deliver the event and support our partners. So where we were coming from really from the beginning was how we used football as a tool to create change. That was our driver first. We were then going, how do we make this sustainable as a business, and came up with the model I've just described. So it was pulling the two together, and we were lucky because, and in some ways, as an entrepreneur, you make your own luck. But we were able to pull some sponsors in quite early on. So most people when doors we were knocking on saying, hey, would you like to support this idea? They were going, go away, you're crazy. But then one or two Nike ones who kind of went, well, actually, we're an innovative company. We like to take risks. We think this is a bit crazy, but hey, we want to go with you. And and that just came about because we just kept on knocking on doors and not taking no for an answer. So we finally got somewhere, and then we were able to start, and then we had proof of concept, and then we built it from there. But it wasn't easy. But it's like anything. If you're determined to do something, you have a vision for it, you believe in it, then you can make it happen. So we made it happen.
Yeah, I was just going to say that as a society, we are very good at identifying issues and recognizing problem areas. what's it take to then actually do something about it? Obviously, you mentioned that you had the conversation about it one night in the bar, and then it was the next morning and making the decision. What's it kind of take to take that next step?
I think it's you have to be committed to do it. It's about like starting in a way starting your own business. So you have to do some research and think about it. So there's the idea. So at the conference, we were already in a place where we were, as I mentioned earlier, we'd done the street papers, and there were street papers working globally, and that's what we were talking about. So we had the foundations. But I think at the first stage, you need to do research and think through what it is you want to do, and then work out how it can work. And nowadays, there's lots of places that you can go to find out how to start a social enterprise. In the UK, there's social enterprise. .org.uk you could go to, in Scotland, Senscot, and so on. And these people will give you advice, and there's lots of examples, and there's lots of really good social enterprises that exist now. So lots of advice and finance, different sorts of finances that's available now for social enterprise. So my advice really to anybody would be, this can be great, but do the research first. Come up with the idea, and you might have a really good idea, but make sure that it works. Don't rush out too quickly. And then once you get going, well, it's like anything that you start. It'll be hard work. There'll be challenges along the way, but if you're determined to make it work, it'll be great, and then it's really satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking kind of more modern day now, that we know that a lot more social enterprises are out there. A lot more for-profit businesses are more socially minded, more mission-driven. Do you think that the definition of a social entrepreneur has changed with that kind of rise in for-profit businesses having kind of ethical missions at their core?
Well, yes and no. I think social entrepreneurs are always wanting to create lasting change. It's one of the things we talk about within Newism. So if I look at the area I work in homelessness, really in the world, I don't think there should be any homelessness. So there's a systemic problem here. And what we need to be doing is trying to create a system where there's no homelessness, and in fact, put ourselves out of business, if you like. So social entrepreneurs can come along and act as a catalyst for change. And I think what you're seeing is that we're having some influence have had some influence on the business sector in terms of how you might do things. So we are actually able to evidence, hey, look, this is how you might do something that's not only effective as a social enterprise very locally, but maybe globally. And you look at something like microfinance, for example, which started off in Bangladesh and then is now implemented globally as a concept, and businesses start to follow. So what's happening, I think, is that businesses are starting to see that you can't really operate continuously forever in a bad world. A lot of business leaders will say it's much better to do business in a good world than to do business in a bad world. And so the very interesting debate last week, actually, at the virtual Davos, which was open to the public with a lot of CEOs, when the debate was around, are we moving from a world of shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism? And what does that mean actually for business? What's the implication for that? And is it how you're structured and how you're owned? And you can see how some big retail companies like John Lewis, for example, their ownership structure is about staff. So moving around, a very, very interesting kind of ethical advertising that's been connected with business at the moment. I saw an advert on the television last night from Tesco's, which wasn't about what products they had at all. It was about what they were doing in the wider community. They were telling a story, which is different. So there's some changes going on. I think social entrepreneurs, to answer your question more specifically, will always be there. We'll always be doing what we're doing. We will set up social enterprises, particularly where you've got what I would call social or environmental market failure. They'll be there, entrepreneurial, at the forefront, making stuff happen. But I think there's a general recognition in the world that business can't just kind of keep growing forever. The world's finite. It can't be making obscene levels of profit. It needs to be putting something back, because that's what customers want. That's what staff want. And actually that ends up better for everybody. Critically though, you've got to create the sustainable business. So you've got to create that in the first place, and that becomes key. Some very, very interesting discussions going on at the moment all over the place. And to me, it's all about then how you bring that into action. So for example, another new initiative that social entrepreneurs have taken globally, it's just a year old, but it's grown hugely, called Catalyst 2030, which you could Google. And that is now, people are terming what we call systemic social entrepreneurs. And it's about social entrepreneurs looking at how you can create system change with a view to making sure that we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So that's a fantastic initiative, because you've got social entrepreneurs coming together, talking in huge amounts of energy about how they could collaborate to bring about system change. So very interesting times at the moment. It's a good question you ask. And there's some convergence starting to emerge now between the world of business, world of social enterprise. And if that can be harnessed into something that creates change, then I think we're all winners. And that's what you want to create, win-wins.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned collaboration there. Do you think that that's kind of the key for this space to really make a major global difference, and take on the massive corporations of the world?
Yeah, I believe collaboration is absolutely key. And when you sit down and talk to people, it's from apparently different sectors. Nowadays, because of the data points we have, we're all put in micro silos, I call it. And so therefore you have this term. But at point of fact, when you start speaking to people, you find actually you have a great deal in common. So if you want to talk to a big corporation leader these days, you talk to that person about, they want to get the best staff. So how do they do that? Well, it's interesting now, because people who might be employed or leaving university decide that they want to go to company A that's good ethical policy, as opposed to company B that hasn't got. Therefore, better for the business going forward to get a good ethical policy to attract talented staff. And so what's happening, I think, amongst the younger generation, lots of evidence to suggest that it really concerns them. They're much more concerned about the planet, and therefore what goods they buy, what the brand value is of companies is very, very important. So by having these discussions, you can start to then work out ways in which you can work together. And so us, for example, in the Homeless World Cup, you talk to some businesses about how they might be connected with us for their good. So they get some win out of it, we get some win out of it. But if we're all talking together how we might end homelessness, it becomes an exciting possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that for-profit businesses that have a social and sustainable mission at their core, do you think that they can achieve the same amount of, or the same level of social change as social enterprises?
Yes, I do. I think social enterprises, in some ways, as I was saying earlier, are at the forefront of this. They're entrepreneurial. They'll make some things happen. Some of the social enterprises get set up and are sustainable for the future, and that's great. But actually, businesses have real power to make change, as long as it's genuine. And this is a very, very important point. They've got to genuinely be doing it. I think in the past, some companies have said, "Oh, look here, we're a good company because here's a check which we give to charity," which is nice. I wouldn't say that there's nothing wrong with that. But actually starting to embed what these ethical values are into the company, into everything it's doing, which is down to its supply chain, it's down to its hiring of the staff and how they look after the staff. It's about looking about the impact that they're making. That becomes very, very important. So it's critical that there's measurements in there, and there's new measurements starting to emerge. ESG, which is in there. Now, it's very important that there's people that do this authentically and believe in it, because we don't want greenwashing. You don't want people simply trying to manipulate this to say we're good guys when they're not good guys. It has to be genuinely done. but I believe you can create good, sustainable businesses that are making profit, reinvesting profit, and making very viable, impactful businesses, and that becomes very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just mentioned greenwash in there. How much is that a danger to to the wider goals and of the social industry?
I mean, I think it's a real danger, because as soon as you get that, of course, people stop believing anything that anybody genuinely might be saying. I think there's, and so we need to get proper measurements. I mean, what we're talking about in the new ISM, for example, is trying to look at fundamental changes, not in a negative way, but in a positive way. So some of the things that we might need to change, for example, might be our entire accounting practices, how businesses are looked at in terms of the annual accounts that they've got to do, and so on. So that might be one way of doing that, and they're held up to scrutiny in terms of the impact that they're making. Others might be, a lot of discussion about this. Is GDP the right measure for our economic performance? And actually, should there be something else which looks at, a wider well-being issue in society and what role businesses can play? I'm a great believer in business. I'm not one of these people that kind of says, oh, well, business is bad. Obviously, I'm an entrepreneur, so I believe in that. So business has got a role to play, but it needs to understand it has a role to play, as we all do in society. And I think, if anything, that this pandemic has shown to us is that we've all got a role to play for everybody else. We need to be supporting everybody else. So you can't just set a business up that's making lots of money, that's mining whatever or doing whatever damage without there being consequences. And I think we're all beginning to understand that. So you can create businesses, I believe, that are doing good socially, doing good environmentally, but are sustainable in themselves. And that's the sort of way forward with business. But we need to have a look at whole areas that we might need to change to create that a system that might emerge. And that's why I'm quite excited at the moment about the level of discussions that's going on. We need to move the discussions on to actually doing some things.
Yeah, and we mentioned there about the kind of perception around it all. Obviously, we look at consumers now, and we all know that we're all far more driven by doing good than we ever have been before. We want to spend our money with businesses that have a purpose. So it's arguably never been a better time to be a social entrepreneur or create social enterprises. But at the same time, we're all better informed about these issues. So do you think it's actually, in a way, become harder to start social enterprises, and because you have to get your mission and what you're doing absolutely spot on?
No, I think it's a perfect time to start social enterprise, to be quite honest. I think that at the moment, the sector, there's finance behind it. Governments are starting to get behind it. There's a greater understanding about what a social enterprise is. There are a lot of good people around, good stories, good support, and particularly given the COVID, and as we emerge out of it, I think social enterprises are going to be in more demand or more needed than ever before. But that doesn't stop businesses being good businesses at the same time. The two can work together, work in consort, if you like. I just think sometimes we get into a kind of very negative debate in the UK, well, sometimes in the world, but in the UK. So if I look at the issues now, which has been exacerbated by COVID, but was there before COVID, about what's happening with retail in the high street, and everyone's negative about it, and then almost going back, how do we get this back to the way it was? Actually, my view is, wow, you've got the empty property. Look at all these exciting things you could do with the high street, which aren't necessarily just solely about shopping. And social enterprise could have a key role to play in there. I mean, some years back, I was in Santiago and saw this great building, which was full of young people, and the energy in this building was amazing, with entrepreneurs starting little businesses. There was people actually making things with the soldering irons and so forth. There was areas for debate, little cafes in this building in the center of the city. And I'm thinking, wow, you could create something like this in every city in the UK, and change what's happening in the high street. Now that's just a kind of crazy creative idea which might stick. I don't know, But that, we need to get into that. My point is, you need to get into that way of thinking. That's where you need the entrepreneurs. That's where you need the collaborations. And that's how you can create change in a very, very positive way if it's done properly.
Yeah, and you just mentioned kind of, younger generations and future generations of entrepreneurs. I think it's probably fair to say that the thinking behind kind of aspiring entrepreneurs has shifted in recent years towards social issues. Do you think that future generations of entrepreneurs, whether that's kind of the ones coming through now or the ones coming through in 10, 15, 20 years, that their focus and their mindset is going to shift entirely to social enterprise? Or do you think it's actually going to turn social entrepreneurs to think, well, actually, I can actually make some money for myself whilst having a purpose?
I think probably a bit of both, actually. I've obviously been involved in some setting up business panels and talking to business people over the years, and I've noticed there's been a kind of shift. So when maybe in the mid-90s, when I was talking, similarly, people were going social entrepreneur, social enterprise, and businesses were talking about markets and growth and etc. I mean, they still do, obviously, but I mean, those were the key things. And so, like, somebody like me was very much on the periphery. Now you hear people who are going to start businesses or whatever, they're talking about the social mission and the environmental mission being absolutely core to the rationale for why they're starting it, or one of the cores. So I think there is a shift here, particularly in the younger generation, which is quite profound in that, people who might have previously just started up a business for profit are now talking about the other things that they could do with that business before they start. And I think that's very positive. Similarly, people in social enterprises might do that. Social entrepreneurs who start enterprises in whatever form, really at the end of the day, aren't driven by money. They need money to live on, obviously, pay the rent, as it were. But it's not why they're being a social entrepreneur. You need to create sustainability. You need to look after yourself. And one of the discussions we're having among social entrepreneurs is how social entrepreneurs make sure that they're looked after. But you need to do that anyway. You need to get your life balances correct. With the same advice would be to an entrepreneur starting a business. So I think it's that there is convergence, as we said earlier, which makes this a very interesting space.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier about the concept of big businesses going from shareholder ownership to stakeholder ownership. Do you think that's realistic, a realistic expectation, kind of widespread? And if so, where do you think we are on a kind of timeline of that journey? Well,
I don't know. There's certainly the people in the big corporations are embracing this discussion. But as I said earlier, it's a question of the structure of it, and there are some bigger issues that you have to tackle. So, for example, some of these big corporations, publicly owned corporations, are owned by pension funds, and the way the pension industry is structured is that these funds have to maximize their return for the pensions, and that's the way it's structured. And so, therefore, somebody who's CEO of a big global corporation will be saying, yeah, but my shareholders demand that I maximize my return on my shareholding. And if I'm going to have to change that, you're going to have to change the relationship between how funding gets into the big corporations so that they can grow. Now, I'm just picking on that as an example of some of the changes that you might need to require to do, but you need to get into that discussion. Mohammed Yunus, famous social entrepreneur, obviously, who set up Grameen Bank, his response to this is that they shouldn't be invested. That companies to grow should do that through loans, and there should be significant loans. So there should be change away into companies to develop through loans and not through shareholdings. So you change the pension industry. But the reason I'm using this example is because you can see why the massive changes that you have to get into. It's not just a question of kind of saying, oh, we're going to be a nice company. You have to think this right through. And then there's issues globally as well. Like this is the big corporations we're talking about. like taxation. And immediately people go, but younger people, you can tell they're really very unhappy about apparently big corporations making huge amounts of money, which they're keeping to themselves and not paying any tax. And so again, you have to work out what are the tax regimes for big global corporations. So these are just two examples of some of the things you need to get into, and you need to resolve them and come out the other side. But my view would be is that there's certainly an appetite amongst some of the big business leaders to look at what stakeholder capitalism might mean, or stakeholder ownership, as opposed to shareholder ownership, what that looks like and how practically that can be developed. And I think that that's a good sign. Is it there yet? No, because there's quite a lot of big issues you need to get into to discuss.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like a long way to go. I've just got one final question before we move on to the questions from the audience. So in terms of the actual practicalities of setting up a social enterprise, what are they? Does it differ from creating a limited company?
Fundamentally, no, is the answer to that. I mean, obviously there are differences. There's different company structures and different ways you can set it up. And as I was saying earlier, there's lots of advice if you go online and simply setting up social enterprise, and there's lots of sites to provide advice. And so there's different ways of doing things, lots of good legal advice around as well. But fundamentally, you're going through the same process. So why am I doing this? How's the finances going to work? What's my commitment to this, and so on. It's the same process you would go through setting up a business, as far as I'm concerned anyway, in terms of setting up a social enterprise. So again, my earlier point was entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs, very similar in their DNA makeup. So it's the same process you need to go through. My advice strongly would be get advice, look around, take your time, but then don't wait, just dive in there, get going. As soon as you've got it right, do it. Plenty of advice out there. School of Social Entrepreneurs. In fact, I should mention them because you know, there's training and advice you can get to become a social entrepreneur, which is very practical. They're very, very good. So lots of things that can be done in this space. But at the end of the day, it's about, right, do we want to do this? Let's do this. Let's make this happen. Let's go for it.
Brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic, Mel. Yeah, like I said, we've got some questions from the audience, and I'm just going to pass to Chloe to go through those. But Mel, thank you so much for the past half an hour that we've been talking. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Delighted.
I'll pass over to Chloe to go through some of the audience questions.
Okay, so we've actually had one about your book. So the first one is, what made you want to write your book?
I started up with Alex Matthew, this organization called the Newism. And what we wanted to talk about was what a new system might look like. So we were concerned that lots of people were simply moaning about what the situation was rather than doing something, and then coming up against issues around the system. So we are writing a series of books. And the first one is about social entrepreneurship. Obviously, I am one. We wanted to share that because, you know, I believe that that's a fundamental part of how we move forward. And so this is the first in a series of books, which is about how you create the change. And we're very, very keen to hear people's views. And so we have a podcast and we do a blog about how that change might come about. The rules being, you've got to be positive. You can't be negative. Only positive suggestions. So that's the rationale behind the book, or what will become a series of books. It's really about spreading the message, getting people involved in the next stage of the change that I think is required.
And we've had one in from Nathan saying, do you think there is an increase in role for not just for profit business as a way of acknowledging that businesses need to make money, but that is only one of the drivers?
Yes. So I think that you can actually have all sorts of different models whereby business can be either non-profit or delegating a certain amount of its profits to different causes. There's all sorts of different ways you can do that, but it's a question of getting the right mix which fits. As I was saying that, John Lewis, for example, which is a business, it actually is owned by its employees, so its employees are sharing the profits. But obviously, it's retaining profits to develop what it wants to do next. I always use sometimes the example of the Body Shop when it was originally set up, because if you look at the Body Shop, which ended up being a PLC, a public company, which was being very profitable, but a lot of people would argue that the initiative from the establishment of the Body Shop actually created a whole wave of change in people's behavior around the environment, around what different products you were buying, which influenced lots of other shops. So was the Body Shop a profit-making company, or was it an environmental movement in a sense? So you get these kind of juxtapositions. But I think it's all about being very clear about what you want to do, and then using any finance you have to further the aims of the business. And there's all sorts of different structures. I came across a hotel group a couple of years ago, small hotel group, and they changed their shareholding, because it was a family-owned business, that a significant part of their shareholding was to be owned by a charity. And so they weren't giving a donation away at the end of the year. Basically, it was about the performance of the business, meant that the charity that was owning a part of this hotel was actually benefiting. So there's all sorts of ways you can actually construct different legal entities to do good.
And we've had a question in from Vicky. Do you think IDEs can be a solution for many social concerns and solutions?
Yeah, I think so. I'm positive about that. As I say, I think there's different structures and so on. I think a key thing in this area, though, would be around leadership, and we need leaders in the sector to be emerged to talk about this. That's why I think this initiative around Catalyst 2030 is really, really interesting, because you're getting social entrepreneurs emerging now as leaders. A recent report that's come out there, which was put together by McKinsey, is in association with a lot of the social entrepreneurs of Catalyst 2030, talking about the role social entrepreneurs could have in helping governments develop their and deliver their programs, how they could work together much better with governments. So very, very interesting. So we need leadership in the sector. But the answer to the question straightforward is yes, absolutely.
So we've had a few questions around people who already have businesses, or people who are startups, and wanting to know kind of what the first step is to make to add a social element to their business.
That's good questions. I mean, I think it's about really thinking through what it is you do as a business in the first case. I'm thinking about, because one of the things you can do is about what is your core business, and therefore how can you make an impact around that core, because that's what you knew. So, for example, I heard a CEO of a big logistics company, and they were giving away quite a bit of money, donations, to different charities, people who applied to them, and they had a kind of fund. And then they took a view that really, actually, this wasn't the most effective way of doing things. They were just giving donations away, and they weren't really, monitoring them, was taking them a lot of time, and how effective were they? And they came to a view that actually what they were really good at was logistics. That's what they knew. The business knew about logistics. And so they said, right, we're going to only connect with one charitable initiative, which was the World Food Programme, run by the United Nations, which is getting food to people who couldn't get food. And the reason they did that is because they knew how to get the food to people. They knew about logistics. And so they gave money and staff time, et cetera, and worked very closely with that program to help it develop. So I think that's a very good example of a business thinking through, right, actually, how could we make the most of something and how could our staff benefit? And it's a story to our customers because we're telling our customers, this is what we're doing. So it's actually pulling, there's a logic to what we're doing. So I think I would say to anybody, think about that. I think obviously businesses that want to give money to charities and so on and so forth as donations, that's fine. Don't stop doing it. I'm not against it, but it is about trying to think this through in a strategic way that can bring about change. So if I look at the area of homelessness, for example, we don't need huge numbers of homeless charities per se. Actually, we need to get a strategy that works out how we're going to end homelessness. So you bring in governments and maybe some businesses. So what would those businesses be? Well, housing for starters, employment. How could we bring all these together and create a strategy to end the problem? So I think it's a question of thinking through that. But there's lots of ways in which you can do that. And the fact that there's a number of questions about this, I think that's very good news because it means people are thinking, right, okay, well, maybe our business, established or startup, could do with some of this and it would be good for the business and good for society as a whole.
And I think we'll end on this question. We've had a few around salary and income for social entrepreneurs and the worry that, move into a social enterprise. How do you determine your salary as a social entrepreneur?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think, first of all, particularly around startups, you've got to, it'd probably be quite low, but it would be quite low as an entrepreneur as well. I think naturally, as I said earlier, social entrepreneurs aren't in going into it to make lots of money, but you have to actually pay people proper salaries. And you also, as your social enterprise develops, you need to attract good people. So you're not competing with the private sector, so it can't be on those levels, but it needs to be at a level where people can live and pay the mortgages and their rents and so on and so forth. So they need to be good salaries. Salaries, I think that people that don't bother, that in other words, they're not worried about how they're going to pay the rent. That it's there, and I think that's important that social entrepreneurs are paid properly, and that a talent is attracted into the sector. That's what we need, and that's starting to happen. So you're starting to see very talented people coming out of grad school or whatever with MBAs going, you know what, I don't want to go into the banking sector, which potentially pays a lot of money. I want to go into this social sector, but at the same time, I have to make sure I've got a decent salary. So I think that's good news. But it's all about what you can afford and what you can do and getting that balance right. I don't think there's any particular one rule that fits everybody.
Fantastic. Mel, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such an incredible session and thank you for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. Do you have any final words before we sign off for today?
No, just thank you very much for inviting me. I mean, I think that the work that you all do and with the Great British Enterprise Awards is fabulous. Happy to be involved over the years. And I'm a great believer in entrepreneurship. And for those people who are on if you're interested in this space, I just advise you get into the space because it can be very rewarding, can be great for society and great for yourself. So join in let a lot of challenges in the world. So, together, let's go forward and create some change, and we can do it if we want, using our entrepreneurial zeal.
Fantastic. I have included some details in the chat function about the book deal that Mel has kindly provided us with. So the first 10 people who sign up for the New Isms newsletter will receive a free copy of the book. And once those first 10 spaces go, we do have a discount code, which is BGEA 10, and that will give you 10% off, and it can be redeemed on the link in the chat comments. If there is anything you'd like to catch up on from today's session, we'll be sending out a replay of this coming shortly today, and you can find a replay and future sessions at www.lightbulb-sessions.com. Our next Lightbulb session will be at the same time next week with Dan Gable as he discusses the power of storytelling through video. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you again, Mel and John.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.